Harvestella instantly caught my eye, and I think many of us, with what looked like a nice mixture of sim life, some farming and an RPG from Square. I've gone through the demo with a fine-tooth comb and broken down all of the visual elements, the performance, looking at frame rates, looking at both docked and handheld modes in what's a bit of a mixed bag, but also I want to talk a bit about the gameplay. I don't think it's quite what a lot of us were expecting, and there are some downright confusing decisions in there. It looks like Final Farm to see to me. Is it? Well, let's find out. Let's start off right at the beginning at the character creation screen. You can choose male, female or non-binary, which is standard these days in games, but what really perplexes me is the sheer lack of any customization. Whether you choose male or female, it makes absolutely no difference. You have the same models, and here's my real issue. I understand that in Japanese culture, there's an effeminate look to the male characters very often in anime and manga, but this takes it a step too far. You literally cannot create anyone remotely masculine. You can't change the hair, so everyone has this long hair. You can't change the face and the clothing they're wearing. Correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, it's exactly the same as the female character. And so I just played as a girl in the end. Now, I know that's a hot potato topic, but I do think it's still sensible to cater to the way that players want to create their own individual avatars, rather than having it very one-sided. The story so far seems so-so. It uses the trope of amnesia, through which the new character is introduced. There's talk that you can save the world, you're not entirely sure how, and when you arrive to the small village of Leth, it's in the quieter season. During this time, the sea light rock, the large glowing red crystal, releases dust into the atmosphere which can cause all kinds of health issues. But let's not go too far into story, let's look more at the performance. Harvestella does use a modern engine in air quotes, and it features some nice visual aspects. Things like the distant foliage and its density are quite impressive. Straight off the bat, you'll probably notice some blurring, and it does seem to use dynamic resolution scaling, although this is much heavier when playing in handheld mode. What this means then is the resolution can drop right down, but there's quite intense post-processed anti-aliasing to keep all the edges on items quite smooth. The effect then is that things look nice enough, although they have that slight Vaseline smear and a grainy effect as well. Now, when you're in the internals of a building, it's much improved. The resolution is right up there, and there are some reasonably detailed areas. I am pleased to see that they've included a handy key on the map, something that hasn't been included in a few games that I've played recently. It's the small things. And the textures, well, they're a mix. Some of the textures are okay. The floor texture here on the road shows reasonably good anisotropic filtering. The higher this is, the crisper the textures when at distance. But then you shift over to some of the trees and they didn't get quite the same love. Shadow maps are impressive. The character shadow seems to be a high resolution. It stood out to me as really quite crisp, and it was even more impressive that the shadows are actually applied to all of the NPCs as well. Probably a sensible choice, and I can see where they've cut a few corners, so static items in the world and those level of detail items have been dropped back so they don't actually include their own shadows, but still big structures like buildings do have one, albeit at a lower resolution. It's still good, especially in a game that has a dynamically changing lighting system, which is tied to the time of the day. I actually like the bump shader they've used for the water texture. They're generally several different textures sliding across each other and it creates this effect, but it does look like there is some shader effect here as well, which manipulates the way that you view what's underneath the water. It has transparency but not reflections, and one of those textures is essentially there to act as if light is bouncing off. It looks nice enough, it makes everything look sparkly. They use that same effect in a few different places. It's an aesthetic choice, and yeah, it suits the game. Character models are very Riser-esque. If you've played the latest Atelier games, there has to be some inspiration here. And the same also goes for some of the animations. The animations in general aren't the best, particularly when you're carrying your weapon in hand. It's like absolutely nothing moves except the lower body. When she's sprinting around the town though, it's quite nice, and it is good that we've got that fast sprint. My biggest bugbear so far are the frame rates, and you might say, well, it's not really fair to look at a demo for frame rates. Well, historically the Square Enix frame rates haven't changed a great deal, and when you consider that your save progress continues onto the main game, I think this, in terms of the finished product is going to be quite close. In some areas, frame rates are fine. Around the town, most of the time you're looking at 30 frames per second. Indoors, 30 locked out, not a problem. But in the most important area, in my opinion, and something we've seen so often in games like Rune Factory, the frame rate tanks, and that's on your farm. The reason for this is the amount of dense foliage. I don't know why they didn't scale that back, reduce some of the level of detail draw distance. And look, no one wants pop-in, but I think we'd rather have a stable frame rate. This drops down to around about 25 frames per second, which is quite jarring and actually made me feel a bit sick as I was trying to do my planting. Now, cutscenes are very impressive from an image quality standpoint. I believe they're still in-engine for the most part, although I did see some telltale signs that potentially some of these are pre-rendered or pre-recorded video. There's some artifacting. If it is the case, it's not new. We've seen that done in a few games on Switch, with Hellblade being a very obvious example. A few positives are the fact that the text size is decent. I haven't got a problem with the text size at all. I really like what they've done with the overall artistic direction. In terms of color palette, everything has a contrast. Every area has its own unique color palette, and it can look quite lovely at times. Before I talk about a few issues that I have, and I think they're quite major, I do want to mention the music. It has an excellent soundtrack. There are some areas that are more impressive than others, and they do a few risky things, I guess, like where the unicorn comes on screen and a random saxophone starts playing. But generally, I've been really quite blown away by the overall soundtrack and its quality. To a lesser degree, really, when it comes to the sound effects, but still quite impressive. And then there's a few issues before we talk about the gameplay in general. Firstly, where are the voices? Now, on the screen at the start of the game, it asks you whether you want to have the English or the Japanese voiceovers. And I know on the Reddit forums, everyone was like, hang on, what's going on? There's no voices here. But that's not actually the case. Every now and then, your character will say one or two lines in English. And I noticed that some of the shopkeepers also say a few things, but that's it. None of the dialogue is voiced. It's not completely outside the realms of possibility that the main game has more voice acting in it. So that's not a finite point there. But if it doesn't, it really is going to impact the overall atmosphere. There's many scenes, and again, the one with the unicorn, where by his dialogue, you can tell he has a British accent, but not having that voiced, it's going to be a problem for some. But then we get onto some bigger issues, and that's where we look at the main gameplay. Now, I really love my Square Enix JRPGs. I love them. I think they're amazing. And I also love my sim lives. Perhaps there was too much expectation on either one of those parts. Now, if we look at the farm life aspects, if you're expecting a Rune Factory competitor, I don't think you're going to get that. It's just not that same level of depth. Your farm itself looks to have several expandable areas. I've seen at least 2 or 3, and that's just ones that you can't actually get to yet. I should imagine they move on even further. But it's the farming itself. Some good and some bad. You rake the ground twice with quite a wooden animation, but that's par for the course, and then you can plant your seeds. I really like the way that you water it. That's actually very good and very fast, but there's a lack of animation in many of the areas that I would normally associate with these types of games, particularly when harvesting. Harvesting is a simple button push and the items gathered. The character barely moves, almost doesn't react at all, and to make it worse, the stamina system is incredibly punishing. If your stamina's run out, you can't even harvest, you can't fight enemies, you can't really do anything, and that's an issue. It meant that a few times when I was out and about fighting and doing other things, if I'd forgotten to take a food item, that would be me done. I wouldn't even be able to fight an enemy to get one to then replenish my stamina. It's something that you could easily build into your knowledge of the game and you could work around it, but that really did cause me a few headaches. Then, as we've seen in so many games, you have the inventory management. And here, if you can't collect something because you have no space, then it will simply tell you that. And obviously you'll eat something to make a bit of space or throw something away. Standard issue. However, there are a few parts where it'll be an item like a repair kit that you need to use in that section. But for some unbeknownst reason to me, it will then collect that rather than leaving it there. It will collect it and send it back to your house box, which in principle is great, but in actuality, it means you've then got to teleport all the way home and make your way through the entirety of that dungeon. Now, yes, it does introduce some fast travel and there's some shortcuts in there like ladders being knocked down, but I don't feel like they've got the balance quite right just yet with the stamina system, the overall way you navigate in the world and the farming. It will be interesting to see how it pans out. Now, something I am really impressed with and enjoying quite a lot is the combat. At face value, it's very simplistic. It's a one-button combat system, but then I am sick to death of turn-based at the moment. But it's the job integration. Essentially, you can choose different jobs and level those up individually, and these can be switched on the fly. It means that you can go from a close-ranged fighter to a long-ranged mage class, and different classes are needed to fight different creatures effectively. It's really simple, but it feels quite nice to me, and you get some new companions that help you out, and from that perspective, I'm quite enjoying it. I know it feels like I've got quite a few gripes, but there is one more. Now, the currency of this game, the real resource here, is your actual time. You're told very early on that at about 12 o'clock you're going to pass out and you'll be taken back to your house, so essentially get back before 12 o'clock. So it was slightly strange when at 9 o'clock I was told, you're getting tired, you should go home, or it's getting late, let's go home. And it doesn't ask you if you want to do that, it just teleports you back. So what was the point of the 12 o'clock thing? I really don't know. I haven't quite figured that one out yet. It just seems a bit odd. And then obviously when you're out in a dungeon, that is a bit longer. You can stay out a bit longer. But again, the formula's not quite right, if you ask me. The hunger gauge is tied to the stamina system, which means that if you haven't got food in your stomach, then the stamina won't go up at all. And as mentioned, if that's the case, well, you are out of luck. You better go find some food or leave, or just go to sleep. When you're out in the world map, I was really impressed with the way they'd implemented this. It looks lovely, and time actually progresses much faster as you move around here, which is a sensible choice. But the final gameplay aspect that seems to have a few quirks at the moment are the quest markers. These pop up in the corner of your screen almost constantly, and I didn't find a way of turning those off. Overall, I know it might have sounded like I've got quite a few gripes about Harvestella. I do think there's a good game here, and things like the load times, the overall visual quality, they're quite impressive. I'm just a little more nervous than I was before playing the demo. Let me know what you think and your overall impressions. And as always, if you want to save 10% on any eShop games, just buy your eShop credit over at switchup.gg using code SwitchUp. Thanks to all of you and to our Patreons as well. And as always, for all things Switch, all the time, keep it Switch up. Cheers, guys. See ya!